Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's forum. This is our sixth such forum since we put up our Black Lives Matter banner that, as many of you know, got a lot of attention. We're delighted that so many of you have committed to this time to reflect with us on policing in crisis, the scope of the problem and solutions within reach. My name is Father Regis Smolko, and I am the priest in charge of St. Brendan's Episcopal Church in Franklin Park. We likewise are so happy to be working with our Universal Unitarian brothers and sisters on this and other such projects. Recently, I was attending a similar conference to the one that we're having tonight, and the speaker did a fantastic job. On my way out, I was talking to another attendee, and she said to me, if you think tonight was informative and helpful, you need to hear Professor David Harris from Pitt. He will take it to the next level for you. You think you understand now, just wait. Ever since that encounter, I have been very much looking forward to this evening. David Harris is a Sally Ann Semenko Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh's Law School, where he teaches criminal law and procedure and evidence. David devotes his research to the study of police conduct, search and seizure laws, and the intersection of race and criminal justice. He is the leading national authority on racial profiling. His 2002 book, Profiles in Injustice, and his many scholarly articles on the topic resulted in new laws and regulations in hundreds of American police departments. He is also the creator and host of the Criminal Injustice podcast, which you can find and subscribe to for free. And it's at criminaljusticepodcast.com. And we're going to be putting that link into the chat so that you can get it. In Pittsburgh and in other communities around the country, he's applied his work to creating better relationships between police and the communities they serve, particularly African American communities, to bring about respectful, just policing as well as public safety. This work resulted in David receiving the Jefferson Award for Public Service in 2015. His most recent book is A City Divided: Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations. It's published by Anthem Press, and it's widely available in great local bookstores like White Whale in Bloomfield and on Amazon. This book tells the story of the Jordan Miles case, a terrible incident of police-civilian violence here in Pittsburgh, and the case's full journey through the legal system. We'll also put a link to the book in the chat for anyone who would like to purchase it, during the course of the evening or afterwards. Today's talk that David will be giving us is entitled Policing in Crisis: The Scope of the Problem and Solutions Within Reach. Here's how we will run today's talk. When I'm finished, David will begin his presentation. Everyone attending should already have their microphones on mute, and they will remain that way throughout the presentation. As questions occur to you, please type the question in the chat box at the bottom of your screen or in the Q&A box that appears most times at the bottom of your screen, but some of you may have it on the top of the screen as well. I'll be keeping track of these questions for David, and when he finishes talking, he will take all of your questions one at a time. So just remember, you will remain muted, so if you have a question, please type them in the chat or the Q&A boxes. So without any further ado, it is with delight that I present to you Professor David Harris.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to what you were told about me, or at least come close.
I'm sure you will.
It's a great pleasure to be with all of you tonight. I appreciate the invitation very, very much. And I know that we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to get right to it. And as you probably are getting used to by now, that means I'm going to share a screen with you. And I hope that this will enlighten us and guide us along the way. So you should be able to see my screen in just a second there, and we'll move to it now. There. Okay. That should do it. So we are together tonight to talk about the scope of the problem we have with policing and with possible solutions that there might be out there. And I want to say before I start that policing is part of a broader net of problems, because we all know that the issues that we confront now as a country about equity, about equality, about racism, about the ways that people are allowed to vote, the ways that they can work and support their families, all of this. We have many problems to address. This is just one piece of it, but it's something that I hope I can offer you something on. This is the cover to that book. If you're interested, the link to it will show up in the chat. Okay, so let's talk about this. What is the actual scope of the problem? Well, of course, the events of the last 8 or so months were all set up by the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, a Minneapolis police officer. And I know many of you were witness to that through that video. I know I was. So it's appropriate that we start with this question of what the actual scope of the problem is. It is unfortunate that the first thing I have to tell you is that we're not all that, we haven't as a country done what we need to do to actually know the full scope of the problem, because our policing apparatus in this country is highly hyper localized. And that, you know, if you go to somebody in the UK and you ask them, how many police departments do you have in Great Britain? And they'll say 45, is it 46? In this country, we have 18,000 police departments, and that problem is going to shoot through everything that we talk about tonight. But one of the big consequences of that is that our data is very poor on lots of aspects of policing. So the best we can do right now for data on fatal police shootings is to rely not on the United States government or the U.S. Department of Justice, where you would expect this data to come from, but from the Washington Post and the Guardian. And they began tracking fatal police shootings only in 2015, after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, when people who are not, you know, ultra justice nerds like me woke up to the fact that, hey, there's no data on this. And so these media organizations began doing it, and they do a very credible job with tracking fatal police shootings. They track press reports, police reports, all kinds of things. And so we do have some data thanks to them, not thanks to our own government, which, as one of our prior attorney generals said some years ago, is just, it's shameful. I mean, there's no other way to put it. So these data by these media organizations gathered from news reports, social media postings, police reports, and it's worth noting that law enforcement's own reports in this area, they're supposed to report this to the FBI, but they generally don't do a very good job. And our best estimate is that they underreport fatal shootings by police officers by more than half. Thus, it makes sense to rely on media organizations that are doing a credible and thorough job with this. Let me show you a graph, and I'll give you an idea of what we do know. Here, this was from June of 2020, so over 6 months ago. That was the best data we had at the time when I picked this up. And this shows all of the years from 2015 through the first half of 2020. It shows you just about where we are with fatal police shootings. Year in and year out, it is roughly 1,000 fatal police shootings per year in this country. And 2020 was on track to be just about like the rest of those years. And so it's a steady upward line across the months, and it usually is a little less than, a little more than 1,000 fatal police shootings per year, which is a very high number when compared to other Western industrialized economies like ours. But this really doesn't tell the whole story, because one of the things that we wonder when we look at this is, who is this happening to, right? And that really does bring us to the meat of the problem, as they say. Here is some more data portrayed graphically for you. These charts here show you what really matters in a lot of respects. For white Americans, there are 13 fatal police shootings per million population, right, over this period of time. For Black Americans, it's more than twice that rate. It is 31 per million population killed by police during this period. Hispanics also higher than whites, 23 per million. Okay, so this is where we start to dig into the data. We see what it really reveals. The rate at which Black Americans are killed by the police is more than twice as high as the rate for white Americans. So this is where the raw data of 1,000 per year, as shocking as that may be, actually the problem when you look at who is involved in these incidents reflects some pretty ugly truths about our society. Pushing a little further in about what we know and what we don't. What we do know is this problem does not actually seem to be getting worse. It is more visible now than it used to be because of the ubiquity of cell phones and those cameras that are everywhere now. So we know about more of them. We actually see some of these. We see George Floyd die, and we've seen it with others too. So it's more visible than it used to be, but the impression may be that the problem is getting worse. But in a numbers respect, it does not seem to be changing. It is not getting worse. However, it's also not getting better, right? It's not changing. As you saw on that graph, it's a pretty much the same line upward every year. It is not changing for the better either. And as that last graph showed us, Blacks are dying at more than twice the rate of whites. That is the really ugly truth here, all right? And let me just push a little bit further, because I think there's no question that just this data on fatal police shooting, it surely understates the problem. The overall problem, which I would say is not just fatal police shootings, it's use of force by police. Because what that graph and even what the 31 per million versus 13 per million numbers do not capture is pretty stunning too. It does not capture the uses of deadly force that don't involve firearms. As I've been saying, this is fatal police shootings. So guess what would not appear in the 2020 data, even of a complete full year? George Floyd's death, because that was not a fatal police shooting. So any police death in custody of any kind, a death by police by anything but firearms, wouldn't even be in that total. In addition, uses of deadly force, whether by firearms or other things, that only miss or only wound the person, those don't appear in this either, in this 1,000 per year. It's only police fatal shootings. And then uses of non-deadly or less lethal force. And by the way, the Minneapolis Police Department, at the time George Floyd was killed, put neck holds into that category, less than lethal force. All right. So what about these problems? Use of non-deadly force, less lethal force. We don't know anything nationally about that either. After Minneapolis and the terrible death of George Floyd up there, we did get some data out of that police department that gives us some insight. Okay, look at this. This is the effect of race on all uses of force in Minneapolis. And the Minneapolis police, as you can see, use force against Black people, all types of force, at 7 times the rate that they use it on whites. All right. And this particular chart you're seeing here, this bar graph, This shows it over a number of different years, all right? And you can see that some of this may have improved in certain ways, but Black people are roughly 59% of all uses of force year in and year out over this time span. Whites are 41%. And I suppose it may be obvious to you that Blacks are not 59% of the population in Minneapolis. They're more like 12%. All right. And we can break this down even further into types of uses of force. You can see here, this covers just about everything that is not just being shot. So displaying a gun to a person, pointing a gun at a person, chemical sprays, neck restraints. That's where George Floyd's killing would be. Improvised weapon like picking up a stick or a brick or something, the use of police canines, body weight pin. I mean, you see them all here, and you see year in, year out type of force. It ranges from a low of 56% for the category of other to 68% for having guns pointed at them. All right. So it's not just who gets shot, it's all uses of force. All right. So we have a problem. And you know, the fact that there's data here from Minneapolis, I mean, for one thing, it was available in the wake of George Floyd's death, but there's no reason to think that Minneapolis is a lot better or a lot worse than any other police department when it comes to this. They may not be the best there is, but they're probably not the worst. Some of you may know that there was a program in the late Obama years that came out of the U.S. Department of Justice called the National Initiative for Community Trust and Justice. And this national initiative aimed to train police departments in 3 pivotal areas: procedural justice, implicit bias, and racial reconciliation. It was a pilot project. There were 6 cities selected to participate. Pittsburgh was one. And we got all our police trained in procedural justice, implicit bias, and racial reconciliation. Guess what other city was in this group of 6 pilot cities? Minneapolis. So that's why I say I don't think they're particularly worse or particularly better. Now, are there other explanations for the data you see here? It's always wise when you're thinking about data and social science, you have to ask yourself, are there other hypotheses, other explanations for what we see? And let me reintroduce you to somebody you've seen before. You remember this fellow, right? He was the Attorney General, of course, up until sometime in December when he beat a hasty exit, perhaps in search of his reputation. That's just my editorializing. I don't know. But he said a couple of things when these data were being widely discussed back in June. He did a full interview on National Public Radio that I heard, and I'm just going to tell you a couple of things that he said to explain this very data. And these are the things I hear from a lot of people, and let me just confront them head on. First, he said, these numbers, when you look at the Washington Post or Guardian numbers on fatal police shootings, they actually show a very small number of Black people killed by police in any one year. You know, it's in the range of, say, 30 or 50 or something like that, or 120, whatever the number is. Attorney General Barr said, these are actually pretty small numbers. Well, it depends on what you're looking at them for, because to look at them as absolute numbers really doesn't tell you anything or anything important. The way to view these is, as we were doing just a few minutes ago, to view them as either what we call odds ratios, or like we were doing on a per population basis. All right. So when we look at them on the basis of how many fatal police shooting for white people per million white people in the country, we get the number 13. And that tells us that this is 13 per million. Those are the odds, right? And then when we look for the same exact comparison, and now it's an apples to apples comparison because we're comparing presence in the population And the risk that a person in a particular group will be fatally shot, for Black people, it's more than twice what it is for white people. Right? So this is what the interviewer should have said, and in fact didn't, to Attorney General Barr back in June. Here's another explanation. Attorney General Barr says, well, you know, more Blacks are killed by other Blacks than there are by police. And I hear that a lot too, and I bet you do too. All right. And that is actually a true fact. All right. But the fact that it's true, again, is kind of a dodge. And let me explain why. They're not the same. Both killings by police of Black people and killings by other Black people or white people of Black people are terrible problems. Right? But they're not the same problem. They are very different problems. Being the victim of a crime, of a murder, of a robbery, but we're talking here murders, right? No matter who killed you, that is awful. That's terrible. But a killing by the state, by an actor who is acting with the authority of the state, and then who doesn't suffer consequences, perhaps, that is a different problem, and I would argue a very serious and maybe even more serious problem. It is certainly not the same problem. So don't tell us, former Attorney General Barr, that that's the real problem. Why are you paying attention or drawing attention to police killings of Blacks when Blacks are killing each other? Maybe you ought to pay attention to that, says Attorney General Barr. Well, I think we should pay attention to that. And there are ways to address that set of problems. But this is different. When the state kills people, when the state takes life, that is fundamentally different. Okay. So why then? Why do violent confrontations between police and African Americans keep happening, and keep happening with shootings at a much higher rate that kills people, right? Why do these things keep happening? And I would say that there are many reasons, but the two main reasons that I wrote about in the book A City Divided and have been looking at for many, many years in my research and elsewhere, the two main reasons are race and fear. These two twin poisons, twin toxins, come together in the worst way to amp up the danger and make these confrontations more frequent and more deadly between police and African Americans, and to a lesser extent, but still greater extent than whites, with Latinos than whites. And that is a really serious problem. It's race and fear that are moving this day after day after day. It's why we hear so many of these things repeating and repeating and repeating. Let me take them one at a time. I'll talk first about race and then turn to fear. Okay. So race. What is it about race? Well, race actually is acting upon us and our brains in this country because of our culture and because of the ways that we are taught since we are babies, since we're very young. It works in ways that increase danger. And there are a huge number of studies, some quite amazing. And I'm just going to tell you about two of them in the few minutes we have together. Here is one. This is called Seeing Black: Race, Crime, and Visual Processing. This study was by Jennifer Eberhardt. She led the team. She's a Stanford professor, by the way, also a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, and also happens to be one of the nicest people you'll ever meet in the world. Her then graduate student, a graduate and protege, Philip Atiba Goff, has become quite a force in this field in his own right. They did this study along with the two others whose names you see. It is actually a series of experiments to test just how blackness affects how people see and how our brain processes these various situations. And I'll pull out for you just one sliver, if I could, of one of the studies, and I'll describe it to you. In order to test the way that blackness impacts the way we see and the way we think, these researchers used a technique called priming. Now, I imagine many of you know what that is, but before they show the experimental subject, the person who is undergoing the experiment, before they show them the main stimulus, they show them what's called a prime, or a priming stimulus. And in this case, it would be either a picture of the face of a black person, face of a white person, or no face at all. They would just show them very quickly this prime, right? And then they would show them a series of images, 41 images in all, right? And they go from completely degraded. Think of, remember when, well, some of us were kids, we used to wake up maybe real early, or if you'd be up in the middle of the night, the TV stations would go off the air, or it was that space between the channels and it would be all snowy, like, right? Remember that? That's image number one. It's a completely degraded image, and just way in the background, there's some little outline of something, but it's impossible to tell what it is. And then you're shown a series of images, and with each image, the snow becomes a little less. The degraded nature is a little less, and the object in the background becomes a little clearer. And by the time you get to the last image, there are 41 in all. What you're seeing is a very clear outline of an object, okay? Sometimes the object is a household implement. Sometimes it's a weapon. All right, let me show you what this looked like, all right? Oops, no, not there, not there. Oh, I guess that slide does not seem to be here. Well, I'm describing it, so that'll have to do. The idea is that when they showed people this series of images, 41 images, when they showed those to them and they primed them with a black face before showing them any images, people who saw the black face were able to pick out the image of a gun in this series of 41 slides earlier in the series by a measurable amount, faster than people who were shown a white face or no face at all. All right. So what it does, what a black face does, is it actually changes the way we see and what we're looking for. They did an opposite facing experiment. You could think of it that way. That's also part of this study. They would show people primes. This time, the prime would be a household implement, you know, a fork, a snow shovel today, right? Or anything else you can find around your house. Or it could be a weapon, a gun or a knife, right? That would be the prime. Then they would show people a picture of a gathering of people sitting around a table. And they would measure where the eyes of the experimental subject would go. When people are shown a prime of a weapon, their eyes go directly to the black faces in the picture among all the other faces. When they are shown a prime of a fork or a shovel, they go to any face at all, but they do not automatically go to the black face. All right. So the conclusion of these researchers is that blackness acts as a, and I'll quote them here, a visual tuning device for the eyes and the brain. And it did not differ depending on whether the experimental subject was black or white. The effects on black subjects were a little less, but still there. Right? So when you see black, your mind is much more adept at finding the gun, at finding the crime object. When you see a crime object as a prime, you go right to the black face. Here's another study. that points out the role of race. This was headed up by Philip Atiba Goff when he was out and on his own. The Essence of Innocence, Consequences of Dehumanizing Black Children. Bottom line of this experiment, I'll just cut to the chase, is that when people are shown faces of Black children versus white children, experimental subjects looking at those find that the faces of Black children, they grade the children as older, larger, more threatening, and heavier and more muscular. All right. Do you recognize this child's face here? This is 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice, you may remember, was killed by Cleveland police seconds after they pulled up to a playground and saw him playing with a toy gun. Somebody had called in to the police. There's somebody, looks like they might have a gun over in the park, but it could be a toy. That last part never made it past the dispatcher. The police, instead of pulling up and taking a position of safety, saying, drop the object, pulled right up next to Tamir, and he was dead within 3 seconds from police gunfire, right? Terrible case, horrible death, tragic loss. But look at this. This is how the police officer, Officer Lohman, described Tamir. Appeared to be over 18 years old and 185 pounds. Right? That was in his police report before anybody got wind of it. Right? He was 12 and he was not 185 pounds. Both a huge overestimate. And almost as bad, maybe even worse, prosecutors carried this forward into their own documents and pleadings on this, even after knowing that he was only 12 and not nearly that big. They were writing in their own briefs, Tamir was big for his age, a men's XL jacket and size 36 pants. Could have easily passed for someone much older. Really? You think so? Okay. That's the kind of effect that race has. If we had more time, I could take you through 4 or 5 more just like this. So what about fear? Well, fear and race really act together. And let me show you what I mean by that. Because I think fear is key on both sides of any encounter between police and African Americans, which is to say, police fear is part of the equation too. You probably expected me to talk about fear that Black people have of police, and I will talk about that. I plan to talk about that. You may not have expected me to talk about fear within the police, but it's very real and it's having a devastating, terrible effect. Let me show you this. This is this book, On Combat. I don't know how well you can read the bottom there. The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and Peace. It's written by Dave Grossman, and he has a co-writer there. And this gentleman goes all over the country giving seminars to police that they or their departments may pay for, private trainings. And these are for people who are out of the academy. They're already police, and they take this training because they want to be influenced by the things in this book. This book and those trainings, and you can see pieces of them on YouTube all over the place, are responsible for what I would call the warrior mindset, the warrior approach to policing. And the idea here is that the world is full of deadly violence. There's deadly, lethal violence at absolutely every turn. The world is full of people waiting to kill other people, and maybe especially waiting to kill police officers. I have had more than one police officer tell me, I assume that every encounter I have with a civilian can be lethal until proven otherwise. That's the warrior mindset. And the idea of becoming a warrior is that I mean, that's a hugely fearful thing to realize, to be taught. And police are taught this from their first days in the academy. And it's reinforced in a whole bunch of ways, right? But how do you deal with that fear so it doesn't paralyze you? You become a warrior. And a warrior is somebody who counters that fear by being highly trained and ready to use what's called, and I'll quote here, righteous violence. Ready to use righteous violence. Grossman's favorite favorite ways of talking about police are the sheep and the sheepdogs. The wolves are everywhere. Most of us are sheep. All we want to do is stand in the meadow and eat the grass and feed our young. But the wolves are everywhere. The police, though, are the sheepdogs. And they're there to keep the sheep safe by confronting the wolves, the ever-present wolves, with deadly righteous violence at the drop of a hat. This is being a warrior. This is what you need to do. You beat back that fear by being ready to be violent. That's the way you do it. And this is taught over and over and over to thousands of police officers. Let me give you some direct quotes. All right. I saw and heard, I first read and then heard an interview with this particular police officer. Right. This is not Colonel Grossman. This is Patrick Skinner was his name. He was an ex-CIA anti-terrorism officer. Currently, he's a police officer in Savannah, Georgia. And this was his take on the warrior mindset. He says, deadly danger is, we are told, ever present. And that's exactly what police training does. Every situation is not just can be dangerous, but it will be dangerous because we're in a war on crime. And anybody can kill you, right? His words, not mine. He continued, the well-documented militarization of American police departments has inevitably produced officers who see themselves and their roles as warriors or punishers or, there we are, sheepdogs. What our society finds so distressing in police interactions, disrespect, anger, frustration, and violence, is not a result of flawed training. It's a result of training for war. So this is a war. And they are warriors. And you know what happens in wars? There's collateral damage. There are casualties. And a certain rate of those things is acceptable to accomplishing the mission. This is why the warrior mindset has to go. What about fear on the other side? Well, I imagine many of you are not surprised to hear this, but Black people, not everyone and not in every situation, have a deep-seated fear of police. Why? Their own experience or the experiences of family members, friends, the stories they've heard forever from grandpa to dad to brother to cousin. This is too common in Black communities to dismiss. Here's something I want to show you. This lady is Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's the person behind creating the 1619 Project. And she's written some remarkable things, and I have used them time and again. And this one really stayed with me. I quoted it at some length in my book. She's addressing her white readers to tell them why Black people don't expect fairness from the justice system or police. And she says, quote, "It's possible this will come as a surprise to you, but to a very real extent, you have grown up in a different country than I have. A different country." Now, is that hyperbole? Yes, because it's not actually a different country, but it's a different universe. It's a different set of experiences altogether. There is no denying it. When you talk to people and ask them what their experiences have been, they don't want to call the police, even when you or I would have no hesitation about dialing 911. They're going to think twice. If there's a way not to do it, they're not going to do it. because things have gone wrong in the past. Here's another example. Some of you may have heard of the talk, right? The talk is the sit down, son, sit down, daughter, got to talk to you moment that virtually every Black parent I know and everyone that I have interviewed about this has had with his or her children when they reach, mid-teens, and especially if they're going to be driving, right? Because they are told, here's what you do when, not if, but when police pull you over. These are survival instructions. And it's not like what my dad told me with, if you ever get pulled over by the police, if I find out you mouthed off, you're going to wish that you could stay with that policeman instead of coming home, right? This isn't like that. Put your hands on the wheel. Do not move your hands. Do not raise your voice. Ask permission to move. If you're going to get something out of the glove box that the police officer, even something police officers asked you for, say what you're doing. Do not reach under the seat. It's this kind of thing. You want to have your heart broken? Watch that video. We won't do it right now. It is called Dear Child. You can find it on the internet. It is 4 minutes long. All right. So, race and fear. Is there anything we can do to counter where we are? Right? These are pretty deep problems, as you can tell. Right? I do believe there are things that we can do. All right, let me tell you about a few of them. Number one is we must move away from warrior policing. This cannot be the acceptable way to police. We must move toward guardian policing. Guardian policing, instead of thinking there's a war going on, guardian policing says, how can I make my community safe, peaceful, and livable for everybody? Where can you find detailed thoughts and instructions about how to do this? Right here. Look at this book, and I'm sorry about the coloring. It just happens to match the background. This is the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. It was released during the late Obama years, May 2015, and it lays it out. We know how to do this, and there are some police departments doing it. What would it look like? All right, let me just give you a little bit about this. I thought it was well described in this outline, in this article, that appeared in the Wall Street Journal in midsummer. And it was a study in contrasts, okay? So warriors choose their own side. They circle the wagons. It's that, brothers or sisters in blue thing against all others. Guardians choose the law and the community they serve. Warriors dehumanize the enemy. That's how warriors kill. All right. Guardians see individual people. Guardians put themselves in the shoes of others. Warriors survive by instantaneous reaction and violence as necessary. Warriors slow down, they think, they doubt themselves. This is the difference, all right? I really would commend your attention, that report to your attention, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, for more on Guardian-style policing. Next, transparency and accountability. This matters. These are big concepts. I know they're abstract, but it matters. What we have now, generally speaking, in the United States, is a police disciplinary system that is the opposite of transparent. You can't know. You're not allowed to know in this state many things about the disciplinary processes and misconduct records of police officers. And therefore, there is no accountability where there's no transparency. All right? We could talk about transparency about a whole host of law enforcement related problems, but this is at the heart of a lot of the problems we have. Why are people with multiple complaints that really stand out for not really being up to the job over the years, why are they still there? Because We don't know about it, and we're not in a position to make a demand that change. There are other things that come into this too. Besides state law, you've got some collective bargaining contracts with cities and towns that protect the right of unions to binding arbitration. And that process does not work well from the point of view of discipline and accountability. And then, of course, we never know about it. So what are you going to do if you don't know about it? Now, I have this particular set of pictures up here on the screen. The Chicago police have had a long history of poor policing that really has made some headlines around the world. And they were about the least transparent organization you could think of. The gentleman on the right, his name is Jamie Calvin. He's a journalist, sort of a human rights activist too. And he fought two court battles, first in federal court for 6 or 7 years, and then in state court in Illinois for 6 or 7 years, and ultimately won the battle because an Illinois state court said, you know what? All these police misconduct and disciplinary records, they're public records. There's no right to withhold these things, contract or not. And all of a sudden, all of the disciplinary records in the state of Illinois became public. New York changed its law this past June, New York State, to allow those records to be public. It's being fought tooth and nail by law enforcement organizations and unions. California passed a law in 2019. All law enforcement misconduct records public. They're still fighting the battles, but eventually the law is going to hold. It just is. And this has to happen in every state, Pennsylvania included. Transparency and accountability. Use of force. Okay. Use of force law only usually comes to bear when there's been some kind of a tragic shooting or a lawsuit that follows misconduct, something like that. It's still a great problem. This is some of the law I teach about. Right now, the use of force law is defined at the minimum standard, you might say, by a Supreme Court case from the 1980s called Graham versus Connor. And it basically just says, look at the use of force through the eyes of an objectively reasonable police officer. No second guessing. Remember, at all times, the Supreme Court said that these are split-second decisions, often in a dangerous situation. This use of force standard from the Supreme Court favors police. Now, you might think it should favor police. You might think it shouldn't. The reality is that it does, and that must change in some significant ways. What you're looking at in that picture is Governor Gavin Newsom of California signing AB 392, which changed California's state use of force law. The Constitution sets the minimum floor. States can change the law to give their citizens more protection from police use of force, and a growing number of states have, right? Back in June, the House of Representatives of the United States passed this particular bill, the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, and it made significant changes to federal use of force law. But states have been doing it, like I said, DC, California. And there's a state proposal here put into the hopper by Representative Summerlee, Representative Ed Gainey, and others that just sat there through the entire legislative session. It was introduced after the death of Antoine Rose in East Pittsburgh and the subsequent acquittal of a police officer there. Our state legislature has shown no inclination to deal with it, but they must do something. And by the way, it isn't just the state legislature that can make a change. Cities can change the standards used by their own police departments. Towns can do that, right? And we have seen movement on that in Pittsburgh that I can talk to you about. I was a member of the mayor's task force for community-based police reform that that sent its report to the mayor in October, and this was a big part of it. Next, decriminalize. And I don't just mean this, right? Yes, this, but not only this. There are so many petty criminal offenses out there that don't actually need to be crimes, right? Let me give you an example. Here is a horrible image you might remember. This was Eric Garner. He was killed by one of those police officers in Staten Island, New York. What was his crime that he was being arrested for? Selling single, loose, untaxed cigarettes. Single cigarettes. This man died in an arrest for single cigarettes. All right? There are a lot of things we don't need police to do. Okay? So many things. We don't need them to be doing all the traffic enforcement, right? Yes, DWI, reckless driving, sure, those should be crimes, those should be police, but equipment violations, speeding, turn signals, expired licenses, we need people with guns for that. And too many situations with car stops, with traffic stops, turn unexpectedly violent. We don't need police to enforce laws against sleeping in public areas. This is criminalization of homelessness. We don't need police to be doing drug offenses tied to addiction. All right? So the more things you can decriminalize, take out of the criminal code, the fewer police encounters there have to be, and the fewer can go that can go bad. I'm going to come back to this point in just a minute. Here's something I know you're wondering about. What about this? Defund the police, abolish the police. Right? This was a demand, a series of, I mean, you saw this everywhere, you heard it everywhere in the early part of the summer and across the summer at many demonstrations. You see in the image on the right side of the screen, that was 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council, a veto-proof majority, announcing that they were going to put in legislation that could not be vetoed by the mayor to defund and abolish their police department. That was what they were there to announce. And they did announce it. They did announce it. I heard it. I heard the recording. All right. So what about this? What does it actually mean? All right. Does it mean, well, it depends on who you ask. Does it literally mean no more police? The community will police itself. Well, for some people, it does. But my sense of things is that they are in the minority. It means to more people, big changes in priorities, in budgetary expenditures, in strategy and tactics. Most people, even activists, will tell you they see a need for some kind of responses to emergency situations that involve real criminal conduct, but that many things do not require police for that. Okay. And many of the people you see up on that platform ended up coming out kind of differently in the end, because the Minneapolis Police Department still exists. So how are we supposed to think about this now? All right. Like I said, is it really abolition or is it a big change in priorities? Well, I don't want to dismiss it. All right. I don't want to do that. Can you actually imagine having or wanting no police at all? I mean, look at me. I'm a white middle-aged man. I haven't had the kind of experiences that would tell me that it's a bad thing to have any police. Right? If my car gets stolen and I call the police, they come and they take a report. Maybe they find the car, probably they don't, whatever. But the police are actually there to serve and protect me, and that's what they do. But if I'm black, I mean, just talk to your black friends, brothers, sisters, whoever they are in your life, people you work with. You will find, as Nicole Hannah-Jones said, a different country, right? The idea of no police can look very different depending on your experience. If when you call the police, you end up in handcuffs, even though it was your car that was stolen, you might have a different feeling about this, right? So don't dismiss it outright, right? In black communities, there is a long history of both over-policing and under-policing. Okay? How are those two things possible? And they are possible at the same time. They're over-policed for small stuff. for possession of marijuana, for drinking in public, for quality of life crimes. That was the great Giuliani thing, right? They are under policed when they really need help. No, they don't have the services they need, or they call the police. Somebody's trying to break into their house, and the police come, and their own kids end up on the floor with handcuffs on and guns pointed at them. Right. So my experience, just talking to people, doing the mayor's task force, doing my work, is that Black communities actually want police. They sometimes even will say, no, I want more police. They've been under policed, but they want a policing that is done very differently than what they have gotten in the past. All right. So what's the right way to think about this? Well, for me, and this is, you're just getting it from me, I don't think about defunding or abolishing the police. I think about it another way. I think of policing as providing a bundle of services, kind of like the old cable companies. You get all these channels, right? Well, they're doing all these things. Take the bundle apart, unbundle it, and then reimagine what police do and should do in ways that shift things to other agencies that are more appropriate for them. Right? So you got to ask some questions. You got to ask, to what tasks do we want police to respond? Right? We want them to respond to real serious crime. And in fact, they spend not much time doing, not a big percentage of their time doing it in most places. We want them to respond to serious crime. But now they're also, most of their time in most places is filled with responding to non-criminal incidents, a house alarm going off over and over, barking dogs that can't be shut up, minor quarrels between neighbors. More seriously, a person in a mental health crisis, homelessness, where a homeless person goes into 7-Eleven and is stealing food, drug addiction type crises, overdoses. Police don't actually want to be doing that stuff. They'd be just as happy focusing themselves on responding to serious crime. So our job, as I see it, as citizens, is to ask, for which task do we actually need the people with the badges, the guns, and the handcuffs? And for which is it appropriate to get something else? I would rather be able to call 911 and have mental health workers respond when somebody's in a mental health crisis. And in fact, we are beginning to see that. There have been a couple of long-running agencies in the country that have done that. Eugene, Oregon has a 30-year-old program that's done that. Denver started a new program to do that. We in this county and this city are moving toward something like that, but it's going to be a while before we see it. But what this would do is it would minimize police encounters that we don't need to be police encounters. And then when you have a mental health crisis team, maybe in a pair with a police officer, but maybe alone, whatever it is. When you have social workers to go out and help homeless people instead of police to arrest them, when you have that, then you transfer the resources to that agency. There's your budget change, along with the responsibility. If you just cut the police budget and say, let's give it to somebody else, well, who's going to come when a family calls 911 because a family member is in a mental health crisis? You haven't set anything else up to do that. You can't just cut it off, right? So I would just say about this, beware of easy answers. Do we need more funding for an investment in the needs of underserved communities? Absolutely. And we need it now. We need more funding for affordable housing, for supporting people who are not housed at all, for mental health support and treatment. We need more money for better buildings and maintained streets. I mean, there's so many needs we have in our community. Let's do that. Let's not wait to have a fight over the police budget to do that. All right? So do it now. All right? So ask what we need for our communities. One answer that you hear a lot these days: cut blank percent of the police budget and devote that blank percent to funding the investment in community needs. I don't favor that approach, because that ties the really very, very much needed funds and investment that we need in our communities to police budget fights. And that will make it more difficult to get that money into communities, right? Here's another thing that gets thrown out a lot: cut the number of police officers. You have more police officers than you need in this town. How do we know? Well, because there's an article in XDX Journal or magazine, and it says, it looks at all these different similar cities, and it counts the number of police officers per 100,000 population. And for a town our size, here's this other town our size, and they have fewer than we do per 100,000. So we don't need that many, right? And this really ignores the factors that make each town or city unique. I'm not saying don't take that into account, but it's one of many things that you should look at when you think about how many police officers you actually need, right? I mean, I can think of a whole bunch of examples. Here's one. If, let's say, you compared two cities the same size, Pittsburgh and City X, and population is the same size, and you found out that Pittsburgh has, or this city had, the one out there has 10 snowplows for its 300,000 people. And we in Pittsburgh, we have 60, or what is it, 200. I'm just making up numbers here, right? You'd say that that city out there is under snowplowed, or we're over snowplowed. Well, when you find out that one of them is on the Pacific coast and never gets any snow, and one of them is Pittsburgh, well, you can't just use numbers like that. You have to take account of the full context. All right. So what you really have to do is don't go for the easy answers. You have to ask the hard questions. And I know that won't make me popular. I know folks will not like this answer, but ask what investments and fundings should be made in communities. Ask that and do it. Do it. Nobody likes to pay more taxes, right? We have to pay what it costs to make sure our cities are good for everybody. And then ask what you want police to do and how you want them to do it, and who else or what other agencies should be involved in providing services that police are not appropriate for. That will probably make for a smaller police department and more money available for other things. But don't go about it the other way. That brings me, I think, to the end of my remarks. I'd like to just say one further thing. I think it's very easy for a person like me to throw out a lot of data and ideas and so forth. I've tried to keep to ideas that I know have been tested and that I know there is a crying need for. What I hope for all of us, myself and everybody listening, is that we can see that there are real needs for change right now. And for many people who are in our cities and towns and our communities, their world is not the same comfortable world that a lot of us live in. We have to know that, we have to understand that, we have to listen to that, and we have to be committed to doing something about that. I hope I have provided you with some suggestions for what exactly the problem looks like and what we might do. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Professor Harris. I'll tell you, the person I ran into was right. Wonderful, wonderful. 23 questions. So, and we have about 25 minutes. So here we go, right off the bat. Are police departments open to changing the warrior mindset, or are they happy to be the way they are?
I get a lot of mixed responses because this has come up in a lot of the police training or talks that I've done. Most police departments will say, we're not warriors. We don't want to be warriors. But clearly, some members of most police departments do think of themselves that way. And what it points out is that this will take a cultural change. It has to change within the culture of the particular police department. It has to become not just something that the leadership, which is very important, says we don't want that. It has to be something that is not acceptable. Warrior responses, warrior tactics, all that stuff has to be, it has to be trained out of people. It has to be made clear that these kind of responses will not do, and that a different way of acting and doing is expected of all officers.
Thank you for that. Now, this next question comes from someone who, is quoting Eberhard and Goff. Okay, and the question is, to what degree can training help us override the perceptual cueing that they talk about?
This is a great question. All right. Training can't do everything. All right. What we're looking at as an overall solution has to include first, writing the right kinds of rules and policies for the department, training officers on those policies, and then holding them accountable for acting that way and not letting it slide. That is number one. That is number one. Number two, and I think this might go to what the questioner is asking. If the problem is really that deep, can training actually address it? I have seen very effective training on some of these issues. Most police agencies have not engaged with it. It is not the 2-hour session on implicit bias. That's a good introduction, but it's not enough. What you have to do is you have to insist that the best training be there. And then when people do not follow their training, they have to be held accountable for that. I cannot stress that enough, because what that will do is it will change the culture of the department. People may have the same impulses, but they can be led in a different direction. They can be trained in a different direction. And even if we can't fully eliminate these problems, we can bring them vastly more under control than we have. And we can look forward to a much better future. And then last, I'll just make this final point on this. There are always outlying actors within any organization, and most everybody else knows who those people are. Now, I'm not a person who buys the bad apple theory. Usually the bad apples are a problem because the apple barrel, the institution, allows them to continue. And that has to stop. That has to stop. The police chiefs who have told me one-on-one in groups over the years, I fired this guy and then he was back. The arbitrator put him back. I fired this other person for doing X and I got him back. That has to change.
Thank you. This might be a little bit of a sensitive question here. How can we get out of the systems where police unions get to adjudicate instances of police misconduct?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is somewhat sensitive. I just want to make clear I'm not against unions. I think unions are very good for workers. I'm not against police unions. What I am against is what we have seen over the last 20, 30, 40 years is police unions assuming big roles in the disciplinary process. And this has happened in two ways. This has happened because the unions and professional organizations have been very effective at capturing the ear of and influencing state government. And they have had state laws that effectively require this kind of arbitration. And they've captured the arbitration process in many places. The other thing is that collective bargaining agreements with the unions have given away pieces of the disciplinary process, little bits at a time, in various union agreements. It's cheaper than giving raises, and the union is only too happy to accept it. How do we get out of this? It is a matter of state law to get us out of this. All right. State law has created a lot of these problems. State law can get us out of it. Now, this is no small thing in our state legislature here in Pennsylvania, which is, as you know, supermajority in one direction. And they have generally favored the things that police unions want. And it will be a heavy lift and it will be a multi-year project. But the state law on transparency, accountability, and having unions get the benefit of binding arbitration must be rooted out. mean, I get the requirement of due process. Police should not be able to be fired without due process, but it is not acceptable that officers could be disciplined, and fired, and then be back on the street.
Thank you. Here's a question about veterans. Are veterans good choices for police assignments? And then a little commentary. Military training results in termination situations, which can escalate confrontations with police. And so applicants for police positions who are vets are given top priority, even when other applicants may be better qualified. Do you have any opinions on that?
Some veterans make very good police officers, others not so much. They are, as any group of citizens would be, a mixed bag. I think the answer wouldn't be to weed out veterans, because some veterans make very, very good police officers. The answer would be to recruit for the qualities that we want, whether people are veterans or not. We should not recruit for prior experience necessarily. Oh, you were an MP in the military? Okay, great. You're all trained up. We should recruit for the qualities the community wants, the character traits the community wants, the experience that the community wants to see, which is generally less about rappelling off buildings and more about, do you coach Little League? Can you show me you're involved in other community institutions? What kind of a record do you have as a leader? Those kinds of things are the valuable aspect of what makes a good police officer. How are your communication skills? How are your abilities to de-escalate a confrontation, not win a fist fight? That's what we should be looking for, whether the people are veterans or not. If we look for those things, we'll get the kind of police officers that we want. Right now, lots of police selection is not based on those things.
So it sounds like look at the bigger picture. Okay, so who or what organizations do you see as real agents of change and positive action relevant to policing?
There are any number of good answers, but like policing itself, it tends to be localized. I think a lot of the discussion that was prompted by Black Lives Matter organizations, and I say organizations because as I understand it, it is not one monolithic organization, but I'm happy to be wrong if somebody wants to tell me I'm wrong. A lot of their suggestions have been helpful. But I would go further than that. I would say there have been plenty of organizations that have done good work. You can see some of it even online. Organizations like 8 Can't Wait, organizations that have been pressing on other criminal justice issues for a long time, like mass incarceration. All of these, and because it's local, you have a lot of local input. Here in Pittsburgh, for instance, in the city, a longstanding organization called the Black Political Empowerment Project, or BPEP, a big force in getting changes made to policing through its leader and members, leader Tim Stevens. The Alliance for Police Accountability, headed up by Brandy Fisher. There have been many others that have sprung up more recently in the last 8 months in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So they're in every community, and I think you can turn to them, along with standard bearers such as the NAACP, the Urban League, and others.
This one's from a veteran who was at the Kent situation very many years ago, and result in things where he had to have a gun in Baltimore without bullets. So here's the question. Do police act the way they do because of the presence of guns? What role do guns play in all of this?
This is a tremendously important question. I think that people ignore the presence of guns as a motivating factor for how police experience so much fear. In my book, A City Divided, I spend a lot of time discussing this, because police in the United States have to think about the presence of guns every time they encounter a civilian, whether it's in a car or on foot or somewhere else. There is no other country in the world where when you talk to police, that's the first thing they're thinking of. Does this person have a gun? Right? Now, there are plenty of law-abiding gun owners. I know this. Please don't send me postcards or emails saying that. But police have to consider that every single time. And that puts a different spin on every encounter, along with some of the other things I did talk about, race and fear, right? Look at what happened in the terrible shooting of Philando Castile up in a suburb of Minneapolis some years back. That man had a permit and a license for his firearm, but the presence of that firearm set that particular set of circumstances spinning out of control, and that police officer killed him. It just should never have been. And we cannot fully reckon with this problem without taking hold of the gun problem. I'd like to see police officers themselves get involved in some of these debates over gun safety, gun violence, and gun control, whatever you want to call it. They have a lot to gain and a lot to lose by the ubiquitous presence of guns in this country. And until we get a full grip on that, you cannot fully address a police officer's fear. That is real. It cannot be wished away.
Okay, now this is, I suppose, looking for an opinion. What is your sense of a church getting involved in some issues around gun control?
Well, this would depend very much on the church itself and the ethic of the congregation and how it sees its involvement in any set of social issues. You would know going into that debate that it's one of the third rails of American politics. It sets people off. In an average congregation, I would expect that you would have some people who are gun owners. It's that common in our society. And so it will be a choice that should be made carefully. And how you decide to get involved, you should be just as careful about. Feelings are going to be very strong. So, I mean, for my money, I think it's one of the key issues of our time. Because one of the things that, I mean, you've asked for an opinion. One of the things I simply have a very hard time with is the way that our society and our government has failed to respond, even to mass shootings of children. I mean, I look at that and I simply cannot understand why we have done nothing. It is, and we don't think of keeping our people safe from that, and we think that other things are more important. So for me, that might be a top flight issue. Even though I've had a permit and I've shot guns, I just think there are things that could be done in order to make our people, all of our people, safe from guns in ways that they don't need to be exposed to. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Just so people know, we have about 11 minutes left, just to give someone a time frame in case they're looking for supper. So what, if any, role does federal funding of the military equipment play in the militarization of the police departments?
Oh, this is a great question. In the wake of 9/11 and those days, Congress changed some rules and laws, and it created a program that allowed police departments to essentially buy surplus military grade equipment for pennies on the dollar, sometimes getting it for free, just the maintenance costs. And these were things like armored personnel carriers, large kinds of firearms, MRAPs, those vehicles, armored up against IEDs, all kinds of military equipment. And very little thought was given to, is this appropriate? The idea was, well, we could have a terrorist attack anywhere. Why not give this surplus equipment, put it in the hands of domestic law enforcement? Well, the problem is what you saw in the wake of the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And that was these things, when introduced into a domestic conflict, one that was already heated, it became so much worse. And police are not always careful about how they use those things. And when you use it, there's a temptation. When you have it, there's a temptation to want to use it. And so after those days after Ferguson, the Obama administration all but shut that program down. And as you probably remember, or maybe even just would guess, the Trump administration opened it back up. So I think that's a pipeline that should close. I don't think there's any good reason for it. If a domestic police department has a need for an MRAP, we're all in much deeper trouble than we even think we are right now.
Thank you. So it has to do with an earlier point that you made about the number of police departments. So you mentioned earlier that the sheer number of police departments lead to a lack of reliable data. To what degree does it also contribute to the problems of poor policing practices that you described?
Oh, this is a great question. You guys are asking such good questions. It has everything to do with the level of policing we get. More than half of American police departments are small. I mean, Pittsburgh is what, 900 police officers, close to 1,000 or something. Most are under 50, and a good number are under 10. Okay, and so they're not only independent of the federal government. So if the Congress makes laws, it can't tell the Pittsburgh Police Department, you're going to do it like this. It doesn't work that way. We have a federal system. They can tell the FBI and the DEA and the ATF what to do, but all the federal government can do is investigate the Pittsburgh Police Department for constitutional rights violations, which they did, you may remember, back in the late 90s. All police departments kind of run independently. They just have state laws underneath them, supporting them. They have to follow certain training guidelines, but they have a lot of room to improve, to play, to be not as good as they could be. And so that atomization, that hyper localization means that problems can fester in these smaller places and in bigger ones too. And there's nothing to really control it. There's no, they don't have to respond to the latest best practices. They just don't. And that is a problem. And what it means is that every community and every city has to demand the policing that they expect at the level they want, with the independence that they want, and with the oversight that they decide to give it. Civilian oversight should never be a problem for a police department. This is a democracy. We're entitled to have oversight of police departments and demand things of police departments, just as we are our schools, our mayors, our Department of Sanitation. They're all part of our government.
Mm-hmm. So an add-on to this, Pennsylvania has a particularly high number of departments for its size?
Pennsylvania, I would guess, probably does. What I can tell you for sure is that Allegheny County really does. There are well over 100 police departments in Allegheny County alone. I mean, we think of Pittsburgh and we think of the Allegheny County Police and we think of the Sheriff's Department, but there are lots more, right? And most of these are very small. You know, they're in the 10, 20, 50, even 5, 7, 10 range. Right. And I remember after Ferguson, I was getting these calls from St. Louis County, Missouri. You wouldn't believe how many of these little dinky police departments we have in this county. We've got 50. And I said, oh, really? 50, huh? Let me tell you about my county. Right? Or we're well over 100. Right. And this is not good. You know, you got a lot of these small police departments. They can't attract people. They're you have officers doing one shift after another, just putting on a different uniform. They're paying people small wages without good benefits, without great training and support. It's a recipe for disaster. It really is. And what we saw in East Pittsburgh with Antoine Rose getting shot, that guy had been dismissed from another police department. But they signed him right up. Oh, he's all trained. We need bodies. Get out on the street. It was his first day.
Well, as a society, we have very segregated communities. Police have to be a part of a community. How many of them live in the community they serve?
Well, this varies a lot. Some communities have residency requirements. Pittsburgh used to, but no longer does. And New York City does not have one. People live outside of police departments. And I think people want their police officers to live in the cities. They want them to be familiar with the places that they patrol. They don't want them to be outsiders. And I get that. All things considered, I would rather have that too. But I think people should be aware that just because a person lives in a city does not mean that they patrol an area that they're most familiar with, grew up in, or live in, right? So if I'm a police officer in Pittsburgh and I live in Stanton Heights, I could be patrolling on the north side, right? I could be somewhere else. And to me, what's the most important thing is not where an officer lives, it's the officer's commitment to the community they serve. It may sound very squishy or high-minded or something, whatever you want to call it, but that really is what matters. Where they put their head down at night, I'm less concerned with. What I'm most concerned with is what they do when their head is up and they're on the job. Do they know those people? Do they serve those people? Do they look out for those people?
This person would like 2 specific reasons why you say that the force of law needs to tip more in favor of the police.
Well, because it tips too far in the other direction right now, and that's really the main reason. When we tell juries, which we do in use of force cases after a terrible shooting, that you may only view this through the eyes of the police officer, an objectively reasonable police officer, not even this particular police officer, that you can't second guess them. Time after time, and even some of the worst shootings, what we get are verdicts in favor of the police, even in ones that we know should not have happened. Now, I don't think that either civil suits or criminal cases, even against police, are going to change. That won't ever be the main engine of change. What we have to do is reimagine them from the beginning. What we have to do is think about what kind of policing we want before there's a disaster. But as the law exists now, you don't get the kind of policing you want. It gives police departments, when they're setting policy and they're training, it gives them too much room for use of force. They should be forced to train that is the absolute last resort. And it doesn't do to just say, well, I felt fearful or something. This is a fine line to tread, and I'm happy to engage on this with anybody beyond this conversation, tell you something about the very good new law, for instance, in the District of Columbia. I think that's a home run. That one was well written. The one in California, I think the jury is still out, so to speak. But I don't need 2 reasons. I need 1 reason. The law right now is simply too broad, and it allows for shootings that get, within a certain circle. We call them, they're lawful but awful. Everybody can see they should not have happened, didn't have to happen, but the law allows it. And as long as we have that, people are not blind to it. And it's hurting law enforcement even as people are hurt and killed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we have time for 3 more questions. This is a real short one, I think. Should university police carry guns?
That's a great question. I work a lot with the university police at Pitt, and for many things that they do, they don't need guns. For a few things that they do, they need guns. And in point of fact, the university has a whole core of people who are not police, but they're kind of security guards who are on the campus and fulfill a sort of ancillary role where guns are not needed. So I think in a lot of places, not just universities, we could do with police that are not armed, right? So I won't limit my answer to universities. I mean, all you have to do is look over at the UK, where lots of police are not armed. Now they will, the first response is, well, look at all the guns around in the United States. Police have to have guns, right? I just don't think it's as necessary as maybe they think.
Okay, here's one that probably you can go a long time on this one. Black people are arrested more often, and more of them are in prison. If that's true, shouldn't we expect more of them to be the subject of police use of force?
In a word, no. It is true that more of them get arrested, and we have data on that. And it's true that more of them end up in prison, and our data shows that too. But remember, just because we have data on it does not tell you what the data says. The data on arrests measure arresting. They don't measure crime. Arrest data is not crime data. Prison data is not crime data, right? And a lot of people make this mistake. They conflate the two. So Black people are no more likely than white people to use drugs of any kind, somewhat less likely to use certain drugs than white people, no more likely to sell drugs than white people, but they're arrested for both possession and sale at double or more of the rate of white people. Right. So if you just look at arrest rates, you'd think, oh, those criminal Black people, of course. And then, of course, they get into a tussle with police because they won't surrender or something. No, Neither of those two facts, the arrest rates or the prison rates, should be taken to justify use of force.
And our final question, I hate that because we have about 4 more, but I think we got them somewhat answered. In your estimation, how widespread within law enforcement is awareness that they have a serious problem? So, is there awareness?
That is a great question to end on. I'm not of law enforcement, so I have to admit first off that I'm not speaking from my personal experience. But from what I hear, it's very much a mixed picture. They feel on the defensive. They feel they're being attacked. Some will say there's a war on law enforcement, a war on police. Not all of them acknowledge that they have problems that need to be solved. I find at the leadership level, it's much more common for leaders to say, we know we're not perfect. We have problems. We're open to doing things better. I've worked a lot with Chief Schubert in Pittsburgh in various ways. That is his attitude, for instance. I don't think it always filters down into the rank and file of any police department fully. I think there's a fair amount of resistance. They feel piled on. They don't feel like they're getting their due. And they feel like every time there's a new one of these incidents in some other city, well, then they're on the hook for it. Right? Mm-hmm. That's part of the reality of our media environment, but it's part of the reality of their profession too. And I think it's a mistake to think that this is all people just pointing fingers at you because the media is out there. So I would tell my friends, my brothers and sisters in law enforcement, we know there are many good folks out there. Do better. We know you can. We want to help you because we all need you, but we need you to be better.
Well, I hate to say that we have to close. Thank you for such an informative session. So much information in so little time. And we certainly benefited. So Professor Harris, thank you very much for this informative, practical evening for us, motivating us to take the next step. So
I appreciate it, and I was very glad to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Absolutely. And so remember, everybody, David's book, A City Divided, Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations. And it's available by clicking on the book link, which we have posted in our chat window. Before I wrap up, I want to acknowledge the great work that Donna Aiello from St. Brendan's Social Justice Ministry and Karen Dennis from the St. Brendan's Speaker Series are doing to guide St. Brendan's as we respond to issues of anti-racism and climate justice. Thank you to all who have submitted your questions during this forum, and to Pastor Julie Smith, who was working tirelessly away in the background to handle the technical aspects of this forum. In a 1-hour program, of course, we can at best only scratch the surface of an issue as complex and stubborn as this one. So St. Brendan's will continue working on this subject and anti-racism in the weeks and the months ahead. Your easiest way to keep up with the future programming of our church is to simply visit our website page from time to time. The URL is easy to remember, www.stbrendans.org. And we will post there and on our Facebook page news of our activities and future forums and plans. Again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and have a good night. Take care. Bye-bye.